I'd hunted that mountain my whole life, and I want you to understand what that means before I tell you the rest of it, because it matters. I was raised at the foot of that range, and I learned to read its ground the way other men learn to read print on a page. I could tell you what had crossed a patch of mud and how long ago, and whether it was moving easy or moving scared. Deer, bear, bobcat, turkey, coon, the slow drag of a possum, and the neat double punch of a fox. I knew every track that mountain could make, knew them the way you know the faces of your own family, and in 50 years of walking that country, I had never once found a print I couldn't put a name to. That was simply a thing I knew about myself, a quiet certainty I'd never had cause to question. So you can understand what it did to me that autumn when I started finding the others. It began down along the creek, where the bank stays soft and damp in the shade and holds a track clean as a casting. I was working my way up to my deer camp in the early light, and I came on prints in that soft mud, and I stopped, and I crouched down over them, and the morning went very quiet around me. They were barefoot, a bare human foot, near enough, but not near enough, because they were long, longer than any foot I'd ever measured my own boot against, narrow through the heel and the arch, and spread wide at the toes. And they were pressed deep, deep the way a heavy thing presses, heavier than a man, and they were spaced wrong. That was the part I crouched there the longest over. The stride between them was too long. No man walks with a stride like that, not strolling, not even running flat out. 6 and 7 feet between prints, easy and even, like whatever made them simply covered that much ground with each unhurried step. They came up out of the creek and went up the slope, into the laurel, into the worst of the rhododendron hell, where there is no trail and no reason for a man to go, where even the deer pick their way careful. And they went up into it like it was nothing, like a man walking through an open field. Now, I am not a fanciful man, and I did what a practical man does, which is reach for the explanation that lets him keep eating his breakfast. A drifter, I told myself. Some poor soul living rough up in the hills, barefoot, maybe touched in the head, maybe just down on his luck so bad he'd taken to the woods, and the strange long stride was just the trick the soft mud played, the print sliding as the foot came down, stretching it out. That happens, mud lies. I told myself all of it, and I went on up to my camp, and I half believed it. But I'd been reading ground my whole life, and somewhere under the part of me that wanted to keep eating breakfast, the other part, the part that had never once been wrong, knew that mud doesn't lie that much, and that nothing I had a name for had made those tracks. I had a soft heart in those days, or maybe just a guilty conscience about a man going barefoot in the cold, and so that first night at camp, I did a thing my father had taught me to do for strays, and left a little food out at the edge of the firelight on a flat stump just past where the light gave out. Some bread, a bit of jerky, an apple. A kindness, I told myself, in case there really was some poor wretch up there, and in the morning it was gone. All of it, clean gone. But here is the thing that started the cold working in me, the thing I noticed, crouching over that empty stump in the gray light. It hadn't been taken the way an animal takes food. An animal makes a mess. A coon or a possum or a bear scatters and gnaws and leaves crumbs in sign, tears the wrapper, drags things off. This was clean. The food was simply gone, lifted away neat and whole, the stump bare, not a crumb spilled, not a track of any clawed or padded foot anywhere near it. Taken by a hand, taken careful, the way a person takes a thing, and I stood there knowing that and not letting myself fully think it. I left food the next night too. I don't entirely know why. Curiosity, maybe, or that old guilt, or something underneath both, that I didn't have a name for yet, the way you keep doing a thing to see what answers. And in the morning, the food was gone again, clean again, and this time, something had been left in its place. On the stump where the bread had been there was a stone, a smooth river stone, gray and round and perfect, the kind you'd have to go down to the creek bed and choose, worn smooth by years of water, set in the exact center of the stump where I'd left the food. I picked it up and turned it in my fingers and felt the cold go all the way through me at last. Because there is no animal in this world that leaves you a gift. There is no drifter so touched in the head that he trades you a chosen stone for your bread and sets it down with that much care. Something had taken what I'd offered, and something had left me something back, and I understood, standing there with that smooth, cold stone in my hand, that I was being answered. That I had, without quite meaning to, opened a conversation, and that something on the other end of it was talking back. It went on like that. I should have left the mountain right then. I know that now. But I was caught, the way you get caught in a thing that frightens you and fascinates you in the same breath. And I kept leaving food, and every morning it was gone clean, and most mornings there was something left for me in trade. A knot of grass, woven, plaited tight and careful, the way you'd have to use fingers to do, fingers that knew what they were doing. A bird's skull, tiny and perfect. A spray of berries laid out in a line. And once, the morning that finally broke something loose in me, a deer's jawbone, cleaned, scoured white and bare, not a scrap of flesh left on it, set upright on the stump, facing my tent, deliberate, placed, arranged so the empty teeth seemed to be looking at me. I stood over that white jawbone for a long time, in the cold morning, and I did not pick it up. And I understood that whatever I was trading with had a sense of things, an intention, a meaning behind what it left. Even if it was a meaning I could not read, I was not feeding a stray. I had never been feeding a stray. I was paying into something, leaving offerings the way you'd leave them at an altar, and getting tokens back, and I had no idea anymore what the exchange was for, or what I owed, or what I had agreed to by starting it. I never saw them at their work. That was the worst of it, in a way. They came in the night, took what I left, set down what they gave, and were gone before the light, and I never heard a thing. Never woke, never caught the smallest sound of them moving in the dark a few yards from where I slept, until the evening I finally saw them, and I have wished many times since that I never had. It was dusk, the last of the light, going long and red across the ridges, and I was sitting outside my tent with my glasses up, scanning the high ridgeline for deer, the way you do at that hour, when the animals move. I ran the glasses slow along the crest of the ridge above my camp, and I came to 3 shapes, and I stopped. 3 figures, standing on the ridgeline against that last red light, up where I'd been finding the tracks lead, up in the country with no trail. They were tall, too tall. Even at that distance, I could tell they were too tall, thin and long, and standing very straight, and they were facing down the slope, facing my camp, facing me, standing perfectly still. Not the stillness of a man who's paused, but a deeper stillness, a stillness with no fidget in it at all, no shift of weight, no turn of a head. 3 thin, tall shapes, standing motionless on the ridge, watching my little fire and my little tent, and the man sitting outside it, with his glasses up. And the longer I held them in the glasses, the more wrong they looked. The proportions of them, the way they stood, the length of the arms, something in the set of them that my eye kept trying to make into a man and failing. The way a word goes strange when you say it too many times. They did not move like people. They did not stand like people. They only watched. I lowered the glasses. I don't know why, except that some animal part of me couldn't bear to keep looking through them. Couldn't bear that the watching was made so close and clear. I lowered them and looked up the ridge with my bare eyes. And the three shapes were still there, small and dark against the red. And then I raised the glasses again, quick to be sure of what I was seeing, and the ridgeline was empty. In the second it had taken to lower the glasses and raise them again. In that one breath, all three of them were simply gone. Off a bare ridgeline with no cover near, gone the way the food went, clean and complete and silent, as though they had never been there at all, except that I had seen them, and they had seen me, and we both knew it. I broke camp that night. I didn't wait for morning. I packed in the dark with my hands not quite steady, and I walked down off that mountain by flashlight, down the creek trail, past the soft mud where this had all started, and I did not stop, and I did not look back at the ridge, and I left that flat stump bare behind me, with no offering on it for the first night in weeks. And that, I think now, was the thing I did wrong. I left without paying. I left the trade open. I had taken their tokens, the stone and the grass and the white jawbone, carried them down the mountain in my pack without thinking, and I had left nothing on the stump in return that last night, walked away from the table in the middle of the exchange, and I did not understand then that a thing like that might not consider the conversation finished just because I'd decided to stop talking. I didn't go back to that mountain for years. I told no one the whole of it, because there is no way to tell it that doesn't end with people looking at you a certain way. I put the stone and the grass knot and the jawbone in a box in a closet, and I tried to forget the cold red ridgeline and the three shapes that were there and then weren't. And for a long while it worked. Years went by. I moved off the mountain entirely, down into flatter, peopled country, a house on a road with neighbors, a long way from any deep woods, and I told myself it was over and behind me, and that I had imagined the worst of it. But here is what I have never been able to put down, the thing that keeps me at the window some nights long after I should be asleep. I still find the grass knots, even here, even now, far from that mountain, in this ordinary house, on this ordinary road. Once in a long while, maybe once a year, maybe less, I will come out onto my porch in the morning, and there on the rail, or on the step, or set careful on the seat of a chair, will be a knot of grass, woven and plaited tight, the same as the ones that used to appear on the stump at my camp, left in the night by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. There is no mud here to read for tracks. There is nothing to find but the knot itself, laid down careful and deliberate while I slept, a token, a gift, an answer, set on my porch by something that crossed all those years and all those miles of peopled country to leave it. And I have never decided what they mean, those knots. I have turned it over 1,000 nights, and I cannot land on it. Maybe they mean the trade is still open, that something out there still considers us to be in conversation, still leaves its half of the exchange, and waits, patient, for me to leave mine. Or maybe they mean something worse. Maybe they mean I left that mountain, owing a debt I never understood, that I took their tokens and walked away without paying, and that the grass knots are not gifts at all, but reminders, set on my porch year after year, patient as the dead, telling me in the only language they have that the account is still open, that they have not forgotten, and that whatever I took from that mountain has not yet been paid for, and that they are willing to wait as long as it takes for me to come back up and settle it. My grandfather's homestead sat at the head of a hollow so deep and so narrow that the sun left it by mid-afternoon, even in high summer, the steep walls of the ridge closing it in, so that by 3 or 4 o'clock, the bottom of the hollow had gone to shadow while the world up top was still bright. It was a lonesome place, the loneliest I have ever known, a small cabin and a few cleared acres tucked at the very head of that cleft in the mountains, where the land pinched down to nothing, and the spring came up cold out of the rocks, and below it the hollow fell away, dark and wooded and steep, down toward country that no road reached. My grandfather lived out his whole long life in that cabin, and when he grew old and knew he was failing, he left the place to me, because I was the only one of the family who'd ever taken to it, who'd loved the quiet of it as a boy. And when he left it to me, he gave me 2 warnings, and he gave them to me with a seriousness that I should have heeded, and didn't. Never go past the spring after dark, he told me, and never answer anything that calls your name from down the hollow. He said it plain, looking at me hard with those old pale eyes, and I took it for an old man's foolishness, the kind of warning the old mountain people are always giving, dressed up superstition meant to keep a body careful in dangerous country. The hollow was steep and treacherous below the spring, full of bluffs and washouts. A man could fall and break his neck in after dark, and I figured that was the truth, under the warning, that he was telling me in his roundabout mountain way not to go stumbling off down there at night. As for not answering what called my name, I hardly thought about it at all. I figured it was more of the same, the kind of thing you say to a child. I thanked him, and I nodded, and I let it go. And a few months later he passed, and a couple of years after that, when my own life had come apart enough that I wanted somewhere quiet and far to put myself back together, I went up to the homestead to live, alone, for a while. The first weeks were good. I'll say that. The quiet was a balm. The work of setting the old place right was the kind of work that empties your mind, and the loneliness of it didn't trouble me, because loneliness was what I'd come for. I'd sit on the porch in the evenings and watch the shadow climb up out of the hollow as the sun went, watch the dark pool down there in the bottom and rise, and I thought it was beautiful, the way the night came up out of the ground in that place instead of down from the sky. I slept well. I felt myself starting to heal. And then, in the 3rd week, just after sundown on an ordinary evening, the calling started. I was inside, near dark, and I heard it through the window, drifting up faint from down the hollow. My name, just my name, called out, once, and then a pause, and then again. And I went still all over, because I knew the voice. It was my grandfather's voice, that old cracked mountain voice I'd known my whole life, calling my name up, out of the dark bottom of the hollow, patient and even, the way he used to call me in from the fields when I was a boy. I stood there in the cabin, with my skin gone cold, because my grandfather was 2 years dead. I had stood at his grave. I had helped lower him into the ground, and his voice was coming up out of that hollow in the dark, calling my name, calling me down toward the spring. I did not answer. I want to be clear that even then, even in that first moment of confusion and grief and fear, something in me knew not to answer, some deep instinct, underneath the part of me that wanted, God help me, that wanted to answer, that wanted to call back to that beloved voice, to go to it. But my grandfather's warning came up in me at the same moment, never answer anything that calls your name from down the hollow. And I understood all at once that it had not been foolishness at all, that he had known, that he had lived his whole life at the head of this hollow, knowing this thing and warning me of it. And I clamped my mouth shut, and I stood frozen, and I did not answer. And after a time, a long time, the calling stopped, and the night went quiet, and I sat up till dawn with every lamp burning and did not sleep at all. It came again the next night, just after sundown, the same, my name drifting up from the dark, in my grandfather's voice, patient even, calling me down. And again I did not answer. And again it went on a long while, and then stopped. And the night after that, it became the shape of my nights, that calling, the dread building, all through the afternoon, as I watched the shadow rise up out of the hollow, knowing that when the dark was full, the voice would start, and it always did, just after sundown, my name, called up out of the lightless bottom of that hollow by a voice that had no business existing. And then the voice began to change. That was the thing that broke me down slow over those nights, because it did not stay my grandfather's voice. One night, a week or so in, the calling came, and it was not the old man anymore. It was my mother, who had been gone longer than my grandfather. Her voice exactly. The voice I hadn't heard in 15 years, and would have known anywhere, calling my name up out of the hollow, soft and coaxing, the way she'd called me as a small child. And the night after, it was my brother who died young, his voice calling me, pleading almost, telling me to come down to the spring. They had me surrounded in a way, all my dead, every voice I had loved and lost, coming up out of that dark in turn, night after night, calling my name, coaxing, pleading, growing more urgent as the nights went on, more loving, more desperate. Every trick of tenderness and grief that those stolen voices could work on a lonely grieving man alone in a cabin at the head of a hollow. And every night I sat with the doors barred and my hands over my ears sometimes, and I did not answer. Not one of them. No matter how my mother's voice pleaded, no matter how badly some broken part of me wanted to call back, to answer, to go down to the spring in the dark and find whoever was calling me with such love. I did not answer because my grandfather had told me not to, and because the same instinct that warns an animal warned me that to answer was to end. I held out longer than I should have, I think, longer than was wise, that fascination and that grief keeping me there night after night when any sensible man would have fled. But I never once looked. That was the other thing. As long as the calling went on, I kept away from the windows, kept the curtains drawn, did not let myself look out into the dark toward the spring, because I did not want to see what was calling, did not want to give it that, did not want to know. Until the one night I made the mistake of looking. It was my mother's voice that night. The most insistent it had ever been, right at the edge of the firelight almost, closer than it had ever come. And something in me, worn down by then, half mad with grief and sleeplessness, had to know. I took up the lantern, and I went to the window, and I drew back the edge of the curtain, and I held the light up to the glass, and looked out, down toward the spring, toward the voice. And at the very edge of where the lantern light gave out, just past the spring, I saw it. It wore the rough outline of a person. That is the only way I have ever been able to say it. It was upright, it had the general shape of a man, arms and legs and a head. But it was wrong in every particular, too tall and too thin, the limbs too long, and it stood too still, with a stillness no living body holds, and its head was tilted, cocked to one side at an angle that a person's head does not go, listening or pretending to listen. And out of it, while I watched, came my mother's voice, calling my name, soft and loving, up toward the window where I stood with the lantern. The voice came out of that thing, that wrong, thin, still, tilted thing at the edge of the light, made the sound of my dead mother calling me home. And in that moment, I understood the whole of it, all at once, the way you understand a nightmare. It knew the voices because it had taken them. Every voice it called me in, my grandfather, my mother, my brother, all of them, it had them, because at some time, in some year, it had called those people too, down into the dark, and they had answered, and it had taken them, and taken their voices with them, and added them to whatever it was, to use on the next lonely soul at the head of the hollow. My grandfather's voice was down there, because my grandfather somewhere, somehow, was down there. They were all down there. Everyone it had ever called and who had ever answered, Their voices kept and used, a whole chorus of the lost, calling up out of that hollow to coax the living down to join them. And it wanted my voice. That was what all of it was. For the patient nightly calling, the stolen tenderness, the love in those voices. It wanted me to answer, just once, just one time, so that it could take me to, and have my voice forever, to call up the next one with. I dropped the curtain, and I did not sleep. And the moment there was gray light enough to see the trail I left. I left everything, packed almost nothing, just got in my truck, and drove down out of that hollow, and never went back, not once, not for anything I'd left behind. And I sold the homestead. That is the part I carry. I sold it, quick and cheap, to a man from off who wanted a quiet place in the mountains, and I stood there and shook at his hand and took his money, and I did not warn him. I did not tell him about the spring, or the calling, or the thing at the edge of the light. I told myself he wouldn't have believed me, that he'd have thought me mad, and the sale would have fallen through, that I needed to be free of the place. All true, all of it, and none of it enough. I let a man buy that hollow, and I said nothing, and I have carried that silence as a guilt every day since, heavier than the fear, because I know what waits down there in the dark, just after sundown, and I know it is patient, and I know it has all the time in the world. The calling never needs more than one night. It only needs one night, and one answer, just once, just one time when a man is lonely enough, or grieving enough, or tired enough to call back to a voice he loves. And I left him down there with it, and I never told him not to answer. And on the bad nights I lie awake, and I wonder whether his voice is down in that hollow now too, added to the chorus, calling up out of the dark to the next poor soul, who buys that quiet little place at the head of the hollow where the sun leaves by mid-afternoon. I worked survey for the better part of 30 years, and most of it was ordinary work, walking lines and setting markers, and arguing with brush and weather. But there was one job, one cove, that I have never been able to leave behind, and that I have never told the whole of to anyone who wasn't there. We were running lines through country in the deep Appalachians so remote that the maps we had were near useless, old surveys, 50 years out of date and more, whole stretches of it that hadn't had a crew through them in living memory. It was the kind of country that doesn't want people in it. All steep coves and laurel hells and ridges, piled one behind another, the kind of place where you could walk a day and gain a mile. And we were a long way in, deeper than any of us had ever worked. When we came down into that cove and found the homestead, it wasn't on anything. I want to be clear about that, because it's the part that started the wrongness for me before I'd even seen the people. We had every record there was for that country, old plats, old surveys, everything, and there was no homestead marked in that cove, no claim, no structure, nothing, just blank ground on the maps. And yet there it was. We came down off the ridge into the bottom of the cove, and there was a clearing, and in the clearing a cabin, an old one, sagging and gray, and half sunk toward the ground the way old cabins get, but lived in, plainly lived in, because there was smoke coming from the chimney, a thin blue thread of it rising up into the still air. And there was a garden off to the side, gone half wild, but tended enough that things still grew in it in rows. People lived there. People lived in this cabin that was on no record, in a cove 50 years off the map, in country so deep and so hard that I could not for the life of me work out how anyone got in or out of it, how they got supplies, how they got anything, how a body could live in a place that remote and that forgotten at all. And then they came out to look at us. They came out of the cabin and out of the edge of the trees, and there were a number of them. And I could never settle on how many, because they wouldn't hold still to be counted, and there was something about them that slid away from account. But it was a family by the look of it, old ones and young ones and ones between, a whole household of them, and they were thin. Thin in a way that wasn't starvation, exactly, but more like the country itself had pared them down, long and lean and narrow, and pale, pale as things that live underground, pale as roots, their skin gone a grayish white that had never seen much sun down in the shadow of that deep cove. They were dressed in what they'd made, hide and old cloth, stitched together, patched and repatched. Nothing store-bought, nothing from any decade I could name. And they came out and they stood, scattered around the edge of the clearing, and they watched us. That was all. They didn't approach and they didn't flee. They stood and they watched, with a flat, patient, unblinking attention, all of those pale eyes fixed on us, on our crew, on our tools and our clothes, and our strange machine gear, taking us in, and not one of them said a word. Not a word, not to us and not to each other. No greeting, no challenge, no sound at all. Just that silent, flat watching that went on, and I have never in my life felt anything drain the courage out of me the way that silent watching did. Every man on that crew felt it. We'd been laughing and talking a minute before, and now we were dead quiet, every one of us, standing there being looked at by those silent, pale folk, and the bottom had dropped out of all of us. Our guide was a local man, a fellow who'd grown up at the foot of that range and knew the country and the people of it, as well as anyone alive, and he was the one who'd brought us in. And when he saw those people come out of the cabin, his face changed. He went gray. The color simply went out of him, and I saw real fear come into a man I'd taken for fearless, a man who'd walked us through bare country and bad weather, and worse terrain without turning a hair, and that frightened me worse than the silent folk did, to see him afraid. He came up close to us, close and quiet, and he spoke low and fast and urgent, without taking his eyes off them. And what he told us was this: keep working, keep moving. Don't stop, and don't stare back, and don't show them fear. Don't offer them anything. Don't take anything from them, not if they hold it out to you, not anything. And above all, he said, and his voice dropped even lower, above all, don't let them get behind you. Keep them in front of you, all of them, everyone you can see, and the ones you can't see worst of all, and finish the line and get us out of this cove. That was all he'd say. He wouldn't explain. He just said it. And the saying of it, the deadly seriousness of it, told me that whatever these people were, they were a thing he had been raised to fear in his bones. So we worked. God help me. We ran our line right through the edge of that clearing, with those pale, silent folks standing all around us watching. And it was the longest, worst stretch of work I have ever done, every one of us trying to keep our eyes on the instrument and on the folk at the same time, trying never to turn our backs full to them, feeling those flat, patient eyes follow every move we made. They never came closer. They never spoke. They only watched, turning slowly to keep us in their sight as we worked, watching us the way you'd watch something you were deciding about. And the worst of it, the thing our guide had told us, and the thing I felt in my own gut, was that they were counting us with their eyes, taking the measure of us, how many we were, how strong, how aware, the way you'd count and measure anything you meant to come back to. We finished the line. It took us hours that should have taken one, and the whole time the smoke rose thin from the chimney, and the pale folk stood and watched and counted. And when we finally packed the gear and the guide said, "Lo, now we go," we went, up out of that cove and over the ridge, and not one of those silent folk followed us out of the clearing. And not one of them said goodbye, and I felt their eyes on my back, the whole climb up out of the bottom, until the trees finally closed off the sight of them. We made camp that night on the far side of the next ridge, a good way off, far enough that I thought we'd left the cove and its people behind us. We built the fire up bigger than we needed, and we sat close around it, and nobody talked much, and the guide kept looking off into the dark in the direction we'd come. And along about full dark, I started to feel it again, that watched feeling, the same one that had hollowed me out in the clearing. And then I saw them. At the very edge of the firelight, just past where the light gave out into the dark, the pale folk had come, all of them. They had followed us, silent, over the ridge and through the night woods, without one of us hearing a sound. And now they stood at the edge of our firelight, in a loose ring, just past the reach of the flames, thin, pale shapes in the dark, watching us, watching our camp, our fire, our sleeping gear, the men of us sitting frozen around the flames. Not one of them stepped into the light. Not one of them made a sound. They simply stood at the border of the dark and watched all night, a ring of pale, silent watchers just past the firelight. And we built that fire up as high as it would go, and we sat awake with our backs to it and our faces to the dark, every man of us. And we did not sleep, and we did not let them get behind us, and we waited for the dawn, the way drowning men wait for air. And when the gray light finally came up and washed the dark out from between the trees, they were gone. All of them, gone, melted back into the cove. No sign they'd ever been there but the trampled ground where they'd stood and watched us all the night through. We broke camp in that first gray light, and we got down off that mountain faster than we had any right to. And it was only when we were truly down, out of the high country, and back to a road and a truck and the ordinary world, that the guide would talk. He told us, then, what those people were, or what the mountain folk believed they were. He said that long ago, generations back, in the hard times, some families had gone up into the deepest, highest, most forgotten coves of that range, gone up to get away from the world, from the law, from a famine or a feud, or just from people, and that they had gone up and never come back down. They'd stayed up in those high coves, cut off, marrying among themselves, living off the land, in places no road would ever reach, for generations, for so long that they had become something else. Something not quite kin to the rest of the mountain people anymore. They didn't speak the way we spoke, didn't live the way we lived, didn't think the way we thought, had become, over all those forgotten years up in the high dark coves, a thing apart, a thing the rest of the mountain people knew about, and feared, and had one rule for, which was to leave them be. Don't go up into their coves, don't take from them, and don't give to them. And if you ever come on them, get away, quiet and careful, and be grateful if all they do is watch. He told us we had been lucky, very lucky, that all they had done was watch us and count us, and follow us a night and let us go. And he would not say what the unlucky ones got, the ones who took something, or gave something, or let the pale folk get behind them, or didn't get out of the cove in time. That was years and years ago. I left surveying not long after, for other reasons, ordinary reasons, and I have lived a long, ordinary life since in ordinary country. And I have told that story to almost no one, because there is no way to tell it that doesn't sound like a campfire tale. But it was not a tale. I was there. I stood in that clearing and was counted by those flat, patient eyes, and I sat that long night with the ring of pale, silent watchers just past my firelight, and I have never forgotten the feeling of it. And I have never been able to fully shake the one thought that comes to me on the nights I let it. They counted us. They took our measure, careful and patient, the whole day and the whole night, how many we were and how aware. And the guide said the unlucky ones, the ones who didn't get out in time, he never would say what became of them. And so I have wondered, All these years, whether being counted is a thing that ends when you leave the cove, or whether it's a thing that's only just begun, whether somewhere up in that high forgotten dark, a pale silent family still holds the count of us, the crew that came through that one time, and remembers, patient as the mountains, exactly how many of us there were, and exactly how many of us they let walk back down. The first winter in my backcountry cabin, I started hearing the hands. I'd built the place myself, or finished the building of it, an old log cabin deep in a high valley, where I'd gone to live the way some men do when the world has worn them down, past wanting other people in it, miles from the nearest road, miles from the nearest neighbor, up where the snow came early and stayed late. And the silence was so complete that for the first few weeks the sound of my own blood in my ears kept me awake. It was the kind of solitude I'd wanted, the kind I'd gone looking for. I had wood and food and a good stove and books, and I meant to winter there alone and let the quiet of those mountains put something back in me that the years had taken out. And for a while, it was everything I'd hoped. And then the snows came on hard, and the nights got long and deep and black, and I started hearing the hands. It wasn't a knock. I want to be careful in how I describe it, because the particular quality of the sound is the whole of the thing is what made it so much worse than a knock would have been. A knock, you understand. A knock is a person. A knock has intention. A knock wants something, and you can answer it or not. This was not a knock. It was a padding. A slow, soft, careful padding along the outside walls of the cabin, in the dead of night, palms moving over the logs. Flat hands laid against the wood and drawn along it. Pat, 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 methodical, unhurried, working along the wall in the dark, feeling the logs, feeling the chinking between them, feeling the corners where the timbers crossed, moving all the way around the cabin and back again, slow and thorough and patient, the way a blind person reads a face with their fingertips. That is the closest I have ever come to describing it. Something was reading my cabin with its hands in the dark, learning it, feeling out every log and joint and corner of the place where I slept. The first night, I told myself it was branches. There were no branches near enough to reach the walls. But a man lying alone in the dark in deep country will tell himself anything. And I told myself branches, the wind, snow sliding off the roof, the old logs settling and creaking in the cold. I lay there and listened to that soft, patient padding work its way around the cabin, and I told myself a dozen comfortable lies, and I did not get up to look because some animal part of me did not want to look, and eventually the padding stopped, and after a long while I slept. The second night it came again, and the lies were harder to believe because there is a rhythm to wind and weather and a rhythm to settling logs, and this had neither. This had the rhythm of a hand, deliberate, even, intentional, pat and pause and pat, moving along the wall at the pace of a thing taking its time. And by the third night, I could not lie to myself anymore, because by the third night, I could tell that it was hands, more than one set of them, 2 and 3 and more, working different walls of the cabin at the same time, all of them padding, feeling, learning, a whole silent crowd of hands, moving over the outside of my cabin in the black of a winter night, while I lay rigid in my bunk, a few inches of log away from them, and did not breathe. Here is the thing that I have never been able to make anyone understand, the thing that was so much worse than if they'd been trying to get in. They never tried the door. Night after night, as this went on, the padding would come, and the hands would work their patient way, all around the cabin, over every wall. And they never once tried the door. They never rattled the latch, never pushed against it, never tested it at all. They never broke a window, never pried at the shutters, never made any move to enter. They had no interest, that I could tell, in coming inside. They only wanted the walls. They wanted to feel the walls, to learn them, to run their hands over every log from the foundation as high as they could reach. Around and around, night after night, patient and thorough and methodical, learning the cabin the way you'd learn something you meant to know completely, by heart, by touch. And I lay in my bunk through every one of those nights and listened to them learn the walls of the place I slept in, and I prayed for the dawn, because the dawn always ended it. The padding always stopped when the first gray light came up, and the days were mine and ordinary and safe. And it was only the nights that belonged to the hands. I told myself I should look. I should get up, light the lamp, throw open the door, shine a light out into the snow, and see what was out there. But I never could. Night after night the padding came, and night after night I lay there, and could not make myself get up and look, because I was afraid, deeply and simply afraid, of what I'd see, and afraid too that to look, to open the door, to acknowledge them, might be the very thing that changed their patient feeling out of the walls into something else. So I didn't look. Instead, after a week of it, after I'd worn myself ragged with sleepless nights and dread, I did the cowardly clever thing, the modern thing. I had a trail camera, the kind hunters, strapped to a tree to catch what moves in the night. And one evening before dark, I strapped it to a post at the corner of the cabin, pointed along the wall where the padding came most, and I set it to trigger on movement, and I went inside and barred the door and lay down and waited, telling myself that in the morning I would have a picture. I would finally know what was out there and could stop frightening myself with not knowing. That night the padding came, as it always did, and worked its slow way around the cabin, and I lay and listened and thought, I have you now, whatever you are. In the morning I will see you. And in the morning I went out into the cold, and the new snow to fetch the camera, and the camera was gone. The strap that held it to the post had been cut. Not torn, not chewed, not pulled loose, but cut, clean through, a single clean cut, as though by a blade, or by something with the strength to part a nylon strap like a thread. And the camera itself was simply gone, taken, vanished into the night with whatever had cut it down. And it was while I was standing there staring at the cut strap that I looked down and saw the prints in the snow. They ringed the whole cabin. The fresh snow that had fallen in the night was printed all around the walls, dozens of tracks, scores of them, and they were narrow and long and barefoot, bare human feet, near enough but too long, too narrow, pressed deep into the snow. And there were so many of them, so many overlapping prints, crowded close all around the base of the walls, that I understood. I had not been listening to 2 or 3 sets of hands, but to many, a whole silent crowd of them, a gathering that had stood barefoot in the snow, in the dead of a mountain winter night, pressed up close all around my cabin, and laid their hands on my walls, and felt them, learned them, read them in the dark while I lay inside a few inches away. Barefoot, in the snow, in that cold, a crowd of them, ringing the place I slept, patient and silent and thorough, and then gone before the dawn, taking my camera with them, so that I would have nothing, would know nothing, would only have the cut strap and the ring of prints in the snow to tell me it had been real. I left that valley the next day. I packed what I could carry, and I broke trail out through the snow on foot, miles, down to where I'd left my truck at the end of the road, and I drove out of those mountains, and I never wintered in that cabin again. I never went back at all, in the end. I let the place go. I told myself it was the isolation, that I'd taken on more solitude than a man could bear, that I'd half dreamed the whole thing in the long, dark, sleepless nights, and on the good days I could almost make myself believe it. But there was the cut strap, and there were the prints in the snow, dozens of them, and I had seen those with my own eyes, in the clear cold morning light, and no story about solitude and dreams could quite cover them over. And here is what I can't shake, all these years later, the thing that comes to me on the winter nights especially, when the dark is long and the cold presses against the windows. They never tried to come in. Not once. In all those nights, with all those hands, with a whole silent crowd of them gathered close around my walls. They never tried the door, never tried a window, never made the smallest move to enter the place where I lay helpless and alone. They only wanted to learn it. They wanted to know my cabin, to feel out every log and corner and joint of it, to map it with their hands in the dark until they knew it completely, knew it by heart, knew it by touch, every wall, every weakness, every way that a determined hand might one winter find its way through. And I have never been able to stop wondering what a thing like that learns the walls of a house for. What patient purpose is served by a crowd of silent barefoot folk standing in the snow night after night, reading the shape of a man's cabin with their hands. I left before I found out. That's the only comfort I have, and it's a thin one, because I think now that the learning was never meant for that cabin, or that winter, or that man. I think they were only being thorough. I think they learned the walls of a place, so that in some patient winter still to come, long after the man who lived there has fled and forgotten and told himself it was nothing, they will already know the way in by heart, and they will not need to try the door at all. I was hiking a remote stretch of trail in the deep Appalachians, the kind of trail that sees a handful of boots a season if that, miles in from the trailhead, and miles from any road, the forest old and close and quiet all around me. I'd been walking since first light, alone, the way I liked to hike in those days, and I was deep into the afternoon and deep into the backcountry when I heard the child crying. It came from off the trail, down the slope and into the trees, far off and faint but unmistakable, the sound of a child crying. A small child, by the pitch of it, that high broken sobbing that goes straight past your thinking mind and grabs something older and deeper, the thing in all of us that turns toward a child in distress before we've decided to. And that is exactly what I did. Everything decent in me turned toward that sound before my mind could catch up to it, before a single rational thought could form. Because there is no part of a person that hears a child crying alone in the deep woods and does anything but go. And the thoughts that did come, when they came, only pushed me on. A child, out here, miles from anywhere, miles from any road, in country so remote I'd seen no one all day. Lost, surely. A child who'd wandered from a campsite, gotten separated from family, been out here God knew how long, alone and terrified and crying in the great indifferent forest. Every instinct I had, every decent impulse said, go, go now, go fast, find that child before dark, before the cold, before whatever happens to a small lost thing in country like this. I didn't hesitate. I left the trail. I plunged off the path and down the slope toward the crying, calling out as I went, I'm coming, hold on, I'm coming, the way you would, the way anyone would. The crying was off to my left, down the slope, and I went toward it as fast as the ground would let me, picking through the brush and the deadfall, and as I came toward it, it moved. Not fast, not fleeing, but drawing back, the way a sound carries strangely in the woods. I told myself, the way distance plays tricks among the trees. The crying that had been down and to my left was now a little deeper in, a little further off. And I adjusted and went on toward it, and it drew back again. Always a little ahead of me, always a little deeper into the trees, leading me down off the slope and along the bottom of a draw, and up the far side, deeper and deeper, into country that had no trail in it at all. Country I had no business being in, and I followed, because the crying was always just ahead, always just a little further, and a lost child moves. I told myself. A frightened child runs from sounds. Maybe it was scared of me. Maybe I needed to get closer before it understood I'd come to help. It was only when I'd gone too far, far enough that I'd lost track of the way back, far enough that I couldn't have easily found the trail again, deep enough that I'd let that crying lead me a half-mile or more off the path, into trackless wood, that the wrongness finally reached me, that it broke through the decency and the urgency, and made me actually listen to the sound I was chasing. And once I truly listened, the cold came over me all at once, because the crying never tired. A real child, crying that hard for that long, would have gone hoarse, would have broken down into hitching gasps, would have flagged and weakened, the way a child's crying does, rising and falling with breath and exhaustion. This did not. It went on at the same pitch, the same strength, the same volume, on and on without tiring, without weakening, without ever once breaking for breath, the way a living throat must. And it repeated. That was the thing that stood the hair up on my neck. It repeated. The same rise and fall, the same broken sob, the same exact pattern, over and over. A loop of it, like a sound that had been learned and was being performed. A sound that had heard a child cry once and was reproducing it, faithfully but not perfectly, a copy. A thing that had learned what crying was, without ever quite understanding what crying is for. It was the sound of grief, made by something that had never grieved. It was crying with nothing underneath it. I stopped. I made myself stop, planted my feet, and stood dead still in that trackless wood. And the moment I stopped moving, the crying stopped too, instantly. Not faded, not trailed off, but cut clean. Stopped in the same instant my own feet stopped, as though the one had been tied to the other, as though the crying had only ever been a thing to keep me moving. And the moment I quit moving there was no more reason for it. And in the silence that came down, the enormous silence of that deep wood with the crying, suddenly gone out of it, I heard the other thing. Off in the trees, ahead of me, where the child should have been, where the crying had been coming from, something was breathing, low, heavy, slow, a big sound, a deep sound, the breathing of something with a great chest, something large, patient, close, breathing in the brush where a small lost child should have been, and not small at all. Not small at all. I did not go any closer. Whatever was left in me of the man who'd gone crashing off the trail to save a child, that man was gone, and what stood in his place was an animal that understood, finally completely, that it had been led, that the crying had been bait, that something had used the best part of me, the decent part, the part that goes toward a child, to draw me a half-mile off the trail, into trackless country where it waited, breathing, in the brush. I turned around. I turned and I started back the way I'd come, fast as I could move through that brush and not run, because some instinct told me not to run, not yet, not to show it that I was prey in flight. And the moment I turned, the crying started up again. Behind me now, following, it came after me, through the trees, that childish sobbing, and it had changed. It was not drawing me on anymore, not coaxing, not leading. It was pleading now, urgent, and underneath the pleading there was something else. Something that came through the longer it followed, an anger, a frustration, the sound of a thing that had nearly had what it wanted and felt it slipping away. It chased me. The crying chased me through that wood, rising, breaking, that false child's voice pleading at my back, come find me, why won't you come? And it kept pace with me, always just behind, always in the trees behind me, and I scrambled and climbed and fought my way back up the slope and along the draw and up toward where I prayed the trail still was. And the whole way that crying came behind me, pleading and angry and tireless, the sound of a child that was not a child, chasing a man who had finally, almost too late, understood. I found the trail. I have never been so glad of anything in my life as I was to come up out of that brush and feel packed dirt under my boots and see the cut line of the trail running off through the trees. And whether it was the trail itself, some old boundary, some line the thing would not cross, or whether it simply gave up, I don't know. But the crying stopped when I reached the trail, stopped and did not start again. I stood there on the path, heaving for breath, soaked through with sweat in the cold, and listened. And there was nothing. Only the enormous ordinary silence of the woods, no crying, no breathing, nothing, as though none of it had ever been. And I hiked out. I hiked out fast, and I did not stop. And I made the trailhead well after dark, and I sat in my truck with the doors locked for a long time before I could make my hands steady enough to drive. That was years ago, and I have hiked many miles since. But I have never been the same in the woods, and I have never since trusted a sound that wants me to come find it. Because here is the thing I cannot put down, the thing I think about every time I'm deep in the backcountry and the trees close in. It used the best of me. Whatever that thing was, it did not chase me down or leap out or run me to ground. It didn't have to. It knew something about people, something it had clearly learned a long time ago and used many times since. It knew that a person, a decent person, will turn toward a child in distress without thinking, will leave the safe trail and go down into the dark trees toward a crying they can't see, will override every instinct of self-preservation for the sake of a lost child, because that is what makes us human, that turning toward, that going. And it had learned to make the sound. It had learned to cry like a lost child, well enough to fool the deepest and best part of a person, and to use that part against them, to lead them by their own decency a half-mile off the trail into the trackless dark, where it waited and breathed. I got out, because the wrongness reached me in time, because the crying was just a little too tireless, just a little too repeated, just imperfect enough that some part of me caught it before it was too late. But I think about the ones it isn't imperfect enough to lose. I think about the hikers whose decency is a little stronger, or whose suspicion is a little slower. The ones who follow that crying all the way in, who get close enough, who reach the place in the brush where the sound is coming from, and find too late that it was never a child at all. They go missing in those mountains every year. Hikers, alone, off the trail, never found, and I have my own idea now of what calls some of them off the path. I think it cries like a child, and I think the last decent thing they ever do is go to help. I took a fire tower posting one summer in a stretch of the high country so remote and so empty that I would go weeks at a stretch without seeing another living soul. It was the kind of job that drew a certain kind of person in those days. A person who wanted to be alone the way I wanted to be alone. And the tower sat at the top of a high peak with nothing around it, for miles in any direction, but ridge after ridge of forest, rolling off blue into the distance. My work was simple. I watched for fire. I scanned the country all day with binoculars and a map and an instrument for fixing the bearing of any smoke I saw, and I radioed in what I found, and at night I slept in the little glass-walled cab at the top of the tower with the whole dark world spread out below me. It was lonely, profoundly lonely, but I had wanted lonely, and for the first weeks it gave me everything I'd come for, the silence and the height and the long empty days, and I was, in my way, content. And then I saw the watchers across the gorge. The tower stood near the edge of a great gorge, a deep cut in the high country where the land fell away hundreds of feet to a creek far below, and rose again on the far side to a rim of forest, maybe a half-mile off across the empty air. From the cab, I looked straight across that gorge to the far rim, to the tree line where the woods came up to the edge of the drop, and it was there, at that tree line, that I first saw them one evening at dusk. I'd been scanning the far country as the light went long and gold, and then began to fail, and my eye snagged on something at the edge of the trees across the gorge. And I brought the glasses up, and there they were, figures, thin, pale figures, standing at the tree line on the far rim, several of them, and they were facing my tower, facing me, standing at the very edge of the drop, looking across that great empty gorge directly at the tower, motionless, as the light died around them. I counted them, I remember, that first night, several of them, standing in a loose line at the edge of the far woods, and watching. The first nights I told myself the sensible things. Hikers, backpackers who'd made camp on the far rim and come out to the edge at dusk to look at the view, the way people do, and the tower was a thing to look at, a man-made thing in all that wilderness. Of course, they'd look at it. Or, when that wore thin, I told myself it was my own mind, that a man alone for weeks at the top of a tower will start to make shapes out of stumps and shadows at the tree line, that there was nothing there but rock and dead snags, and my own loneliness painting figures on them. I told myself these things, and they held for a night or two, but they did not hold because the watchers came back. Every dusk, every single evening, as the light began to fail, I would look across the gorge, and they would be there, at the same place on the far rim, the same number of them, standing in the same loose line, facing the tower, watching, motionless, until the dark took them. And hikers do not do that. Hikers do not come out to the exact same spot, at the exact same hour, night after night, to stand stock still and stare at a fire tower across a gorge. Hikers move on. Hikers build fires and make noise and leave. These came back the same ones, the same number, the same patient stillness, evening after evening, and no shadow and no stump comes back at dusk and stands and watches you. And I knew, somewhere in the second week of it, that whatever was on that far rim was real, and was watching me on purpose. It got so I dreaded the dusk. The days were fine, bright and ordinary and empty, but as the afternoon wore on, and the light began to slant and lengthen, the dread would start to build in me, because I knew that when the light failed, they would be there, across the gorge, watching, and they always were. I took to watching them back, which I think was a mistake, holding the glasses on them through the failing light, trying to make them out. And the more I looked, the worse it got, because the better I could see them, the less they looked like people. They were too thin. They stood too still, with that deep, unnatural stillness that nothing living holds for long. And they never did anything. They never gestured, never sat, never moved among themselves, never built a fire or pitched a camp, never did any of the 1,000 small things that people do when they stand somewhere. They only stood in a line at the edge of the drop and faced the tower and watched for as long as there was light to watch by, and then the dark would swallow them, and I would be alone at the top of my tower in the night, knowing they were still out there across the gorge in the black, facing me. Finally, I radioed it in. I'd held off, because what do you say? How do you report a thing like that, without sounding as though the solitude has cracked you? But the dread had worn me down, and I needed to say it to another human voice. And so one evening I got on the radio to the ranger station down below, and I described it, the figures on the far rim, the watching, the way they came back every dusk. And the man who answered was an old ranger, a man who'd worked that country his whole life. And I will never forget the way he went quiet when I described it. He went quiet for a long moment, a quiet that told me more than any words would have. And then he came back on, and his voice was careful, low, the voice of a man choosing his words. He told me that the far rim, the country across the gorge, was a place the local people didn't go. That there were families up there, he said, or something like families, that had been up in that country a long, long time, longer than the park, longer than the trails, longer than anyone could rightly say, and that they kept to their side, and the rest of the world kept to its side, and that was how it had always been, and how it was meant to stay. He told me my job was to watch for fire and nothing else. He told me not to watch them, not to study them, not to signal them or call to them, or do anything at all that acknowledged them. And he told me, last, in that same careful low voice, to keep my lights off at night, to draw the curtains in the cab, and to stop looking across the gorge. And then he signed off, and he never spoke of it again. And when I tried to raise the subject another time, he changed it, flatly, and I understood that the conversation was closed. I did what he said. I served out the rest of my season, with the lamps dark every night, the curtains drawn across the glass walls of the cab, sitting in the black, so that no light of mine showed across the gorge, and I stopped watching them through the glasses, stopped studying them, did my work in the daylight, and shut myself into the dark cab at dusk, and did not look. But I knew they were there. Every evening, before I drew the curtains, I could not help one glance across the gorge, and every evening they were there, the same line of thin, pale figures at the far tree line, facing the tower, watching, and then I would draw the curtains and put out the lamp and sit in the dark and feel them out there, watching the tower through the night, patient, motionless, fixed on me across that empty drop. They watched the tower every dusk until the very last day of my posting. And when my season ended and I climbed down out of that tower for the last time and hiked out and drove away, I never went back, and I never took another tower posting. And I never learned what they were, or why they watched, or what they wanted with a man alone at the top of a tower in the high country. That was a long time ago now, and I have lived a whole life since, down in the low country among people, and most of the time I don't think of it at all. But it has never fully left me, and on certain nights it comes back whole, and the thing I think about, the thing that has stayed with me and frightened me all these years, is not that they watched. It's the gorge. That deep cut of empty air between my tower and the far rim, hundreds of feet down and a half-mile across, that great impassable drop that lay between me and them every single night of that long season. Because that gorge was the one thing between us. That was all that stood between me and whatever those thin, pale watchers were. The only reason I sat safe in my dark tower, and they stayed on their far rim and watched and never came. The gorge was the wall, and I have been grateful all my life that they had no way across it, that the land itself kept them on their side. But I have also been afraid, every year since, in a quiet way that never quite goes off, of one simple thing. They watched that tower every night, patient, fixed, studying it, the way you study a thing you mean to reach. And I have never been able to stop wondering what they were waiting for, all those patient nights, what they were watching for, what they were learning. And I am afraid, on the bad nights, of the truth I will never know, which is whether they are still over there, across that gorge in the high country, watching that tower in the dark, patient as the mountains, waiting. And I am most afraid of the one thing I would not be there to see. The night something finally tells them, after all the long, patient years of watching, that they have found a way across. 3 men from my town went up to hunt the high ridges one November, and only one of them came back. And the story he told in the days after, before he stopped talking about it altogether, and then very nearly stopped talking at all, is the one I have carried with me ever since. I knew all 3 of them. It was a small town, the kind where everybody knows everybody, and these were ordinary men, hunters all their lives, men who'd grown up in those mountains and knew the high country as well as anyone, not the sort to spook or to tell tall tales. They went up after deer the way they did every November, deep into the high ridges where the big bucks held, country far back from any road, and they meant to camp 3 or 4 nights and hunt hard and come home with meat. 2 of them never came home at all, and the one who did was never the same man again. And what he told me, in a low voice, his hands not quite steady, in the short while, before he shut the whole thing away inside himself forever, is what I'm going to tell you now. They'd hiked in deep, he said, deeper than they usually went, up to a flat shoulder of one of the high ridges where they'd had luck before. And they'd made their camp there the first afternoon, pitched their tents, and built a good fire, and settled in. 3 old friends, easy in country, they knew. And that first night after dark, with the 3 of them sitting around the fire, something had begun to circle them. Just past the firelight, out in the dark, where the light gave way, something moved around their camp. They'd catch it at the edge of vision, a shape passing between the trees just beyond the reach of the flames, thin and quick and quiet, circling, and when they turned to look straight at it, there was nothing, only the dark. They figured it for a bear at first, or a big cat drawn by the smell of their food, and they made noise and built the fire up and kept their rifles close, the way you do. But it didn't behave like any animal. It circled slow and patient, all around the camp, just out past the light, and it never came in and never fled, and never made the sounds an animal makes. And after a while, it stopped, or they stopped catching it, and they told each other it had moved on, and they slept uneasy and woke to morning. And in the morning, their gear had been gone through. That was the first thing that turned it strange. Every pack, every bag, had been opened in the night and gone through and closed again. Not robbed. That was the thing he kept coming back to, telling it. Nothing was taken. Nothing was scattered or torn or carried off the way an animal would do it. Their packs had been carefully opened, the contents examined, and then closed back up, set right, almost neat, as though something had wanted not to take their things, but to know them, to learn what these men carried, to study them through their belongings, while they slept a few feet away. They stood there in the morning light, looking at their gone-through gear, and not one of them could explain it, and a coldness got into the camp that day that didn't leave. The second night it came back, and it came closer. The circling started again after dark, just past the firelight, but nearer now, tighter, and this time it made sounds. And the sounds were the thing that began to break them, because they were not animal sounds. Out in the dark as it circled, the thing tried sounds, words almost, fragments of speech, broken pieces of it, and worst of all, pieces of their own voices. They heard their own laughter come back at them, out of the dark, wrong, distorted, a snatch of one man's laugh played back not quite right. And then a few syllables in another man's voice, a piece of a word, a fragment of the way one of them talked, tried out and turned over in the dark by something that was learning them, practicing them, the way you'd practice a language you didn't yet speak. They sat frozen around the fire that second night, listening to a thing in the dark wear pieces of their own voices. And they did not sleep at all, and when dawn came, the 3 of them were hollow-eyed, and silent and afraid, and they should have left then, that morning, all of them. He knew it after. They should have packed and run that second morning. But hunters are proud and stubborn men, and they told each other it was some trick of the dark, some animal that mimicked like a bird mimics. And they stayed one more night, and that was the night it took them. The third night, the circling came, and the sounds came, closer than ever. And then his two friends did the thing you must never do. They got up, whether out of courage or anger, or just the unbearable need to know. The two of them took up their rifles and walked out past the fire, out into the dark toward the circling thing, to look, to face it, to end it. And they did not come back. He sat by the fire and waited, and they did not come back, and he heard no shot, no shout, no struggle, nothing, just the two of them walking out of the firelight into the dark, and then silence. And then, after a while, the voices started. His two friends, out there in the dark, calling to him, calling his name in their familiar voices, the voices he'd known his whole life, telling him it was all right, telling him they'd found something, telling him to come out, come on out, it's fine, come see, coaxing him, calling him out, past the fire, into the dark, the way the two of them had gone. And he knew. That was the thing he told me, the thing that had hollowed him out, and that he could never get past. He knew their voices, knew them as well as he knew his own. And he knew, listening to them call to him out of the dark, that it was not them, because the voices were too patient. No living man, lost or hurt or frightened in the dark, calls with that kind of patience, that even unhurried, endless coaxing, the same gentle calling, over and over, without rising, without breaking, without any of the fear or urgency a real man's voice would carry out there in the black. It was his friends' voices exactly, every tone of them, but with nothing human left underneath, the same flat patience that the circling thing had always had. And he understood, sitting frozen by that fire, that the thing in the dark had taken his friends, taken them somehow out past the firelight, and taken their voices with them, and was using those voices now, those beloved familiar voices, to call him out into the dark to join them. He did not go out. God knows everything in him must have wanted to, every bond of friendship and every decent instinct screaming at him that his friends were out there and needed him. But underneath all that was the cold animal certainty that the voices were wrong, were too patient, were bait, and he clung to that certainty and he did not move. He sat by that fire all the rest of the night, feeding it, keeping it high, while his friends' voices called to him out of the dark, patient and loving and endless. Come out, come on out, it's all right. And he did not answer, and he did not go, and he sat there, shaking and praying for the dawn, while the voices of the men he'd hunted with his whole life coaxed him toward the dark from every side. At first light he ran. He left everything, the tents, the gear, the meat, everything but his rifle, and he ran down off that ridge as fast as a man can go through that country, and he did not stop. And as he came down off the high shoulder, near the tree line, he made the mistake of looking back once. And what he saw at the tree line behind him was two figures. Two figures standing at the edge of the trees, wearing his friends' coats, the bright orange hunting coats his two friends had worn, the coats he'd know anywhere. But the figures inside the coats stood wrong. He could never say exactly how, only that they stood wrong, the proportions of them off, the stillness of them deep and unnatural. Two shapes wearing his friend's bright coats and standing at the tree line watching him go. Motionless, patient, wrong, and he turned and ran and did not look back again, and he made it down off that mountain alive. The only one of the three who did. They sent search parties up, of course, when he came down with his story, as much of it as he could tell. They combed those high ridges for days, for the two missing men, and they found the camp, the tents still standing, the gear still there. And they found the coats, the two bright orange hunting coats found high up on the ridge, far from the camp, folded neatly and set on a stump, side by side, square and careful, up in country, where no one had any business folding anything, where two lost or hurt or dying men would never have stopped to fold their coats and set them tidy on a stump. Just the coats, folded, waiting. They never found the men. Not that season and not ever. No sign of them, no bodies, nothing. Two experienced hunters, simply gone off the face of that mountain, and all that was ever found of them was their coats, folded neat on a stump, high up, where the thin, pale, wrong things at the tree line had left them. The one who came back never hunted again. He never went up into the high country again, never carried a rifle, never spoke of that November, after those first few days when he told it to the searchers. And to a few of us, low and shaking, he shut it away, and he kept it shut for the rest of his life. And he grew quieter and stranger as the years went on, a hollowed-out kind of man. And there was one thing, one tell, that stayed with him to the end. He could not bear to be called from anywhere he couldn't see. If you called his name from another room, from around a corner, from anywhere out of sight, even in a familiar voice, even years and years later, down in town far from any mountain, he would flinch, a deep, helpless flinch, and go pale and not answer. Not until he could see your face and know it was you. Because he had learned on that ridge that a voice you love calling you from somewhere you can't see is the most dangerous sound in the world, and he never unlearned it. And he carried that flinch to his grave. And I have carried his story, and I will tell you that I have never since been easy in the high country at night, and that when the dark comes down and something calls my name from out past the firelight in a voice I know, I think of those two coats folded neat on a stump where no man would fold them, and I keep my mouth shut, and I do not go out. My grandmother kept a custom that I thought, for most of my life, was just the harmless foolishness of an old woman who'd lived too long alone in the mountains. Her place sat at the edge of the deep woods, an old farmhouse with a few cleared acres around it, and beyond the cleared land, the forest began and ran back unbroken for miles into country that had never been logged or settled or tamed. And every evening, at dusk, without fail, in every weather and every season, my grandmother would carry a small offering out to the edge of her property, to where the cleared land met the tree line, and she would set it on a flat gray stone that sat there at the border, half sunk into the ground, worn smooth on top from long use. The offering was never much. A little food, whatever she had, a bit of bread, a handful of meal, some scrap of meat, and sometimes a bit of cloth, a strip of fabric, a button, a small handmade thing. She'd set it on the stone, and she'd say a few words I never caught, "Lo," and then she'd come back to the house, and that was the custom, every single dusk of her life. And she had a rule that went with it, and she gave it to me more than once, when I was a boy spending summers at her place. "You never let the sun go down without leaving something for the folk in the woods," she'd say. "And you never, ever stay out past dark, on the wrong side of that stone." She said it plainly, the way she said true things, not the way you tell a child a story, but the way you tell a child to stay out of the road. I asked her once who the folk in the woods were, and she just looked at me a long moment and said, "The ones who were here first." And she never explained beyond that, and something in the way she said it kept me from asking again. I loved my grandmother, but I grew up and grew modern and moved off to the world of towns and roads and electric light, and I filed the offering away, with all the other quaint old mountain ways. The signs and the sayings and the little superstitions of people who'd lived too close to the dark for too long. I thought it was foolishness. Sweet, harmless foolishness. I was sure of it. When she passed, the place came to me, and after a time I went back to live in it, wanting the quiet and the land and a slower kind of life. And I did not keep the custom. Of course I didn't. I was a grown modern man, and I did not believe in feeding the dark, in leaving good food out on a rock at the edge of the woods every night for folk who weren't there. It seemed to me a sad old habit, and I let it lapse without a second thought. The flat stone sitting empty at the tree line. The offering stopped, and for the first few days I thought no more about it at all. The visits started within the week. It began at the windows. The first night it was just a feeling. The sense of being watched that you get sometimes alone in an old house, and I dismissed it. But the second night, I heard something at the window after dark, a soft sound, and I went to it and saw nothing but the black yard and the darker line of the trees beyond. And I told myself it was a branch, an animal, the wind. The third night it was worse, sounds at more than one window, soft and deliberate, and the feeling of being watched grown so strong that I couldn't sit easy in my own front room. And then came the padding. The same sound my grandmother's old place had never made in all my summers there. A slow, careful padding along the outside walls of the house in the dead of night, palms moving over the wood, patient and methodical, working along the walls, around the house. The way you'd feel out something in the dark with your hands. I lay in bed and listened to it move around the house, and the cold got into me in a way that no rational explanation could warm. Because there is no animal and no wind that pats a wall with the flat of a hand, slow and deliberate, learning it. And in the mornings I began to find the prints. In the soft dirt of my grandmother's old garden, at first out near the tree line, narrow and long and barefoot, bare human feet, but not quite, too long, too narrow, pressed deep, and each morning they were closer to the house. That was the thing that finally broke through my modern certainty, the thing I could not explain away, no matter how I tried. The prints came closer every night. The first morning they were out at the edge of the cleared land, near the tree line, near the empty stone. The next morning, they were halfway across the garden. The morning after that, they were closer still, up near the house, and the night sounds at the windows and the padding on the walls came with them, the whole thing drawing in, night by night, closer and closer, the folk from the woods no longer content to keep to the tree line, coming in across the cleared land toward the house, toward me, a little nearer every single night. And it was standing in that garden one cold morning, looking down at a line of those long, narrow, barefoot prints that had come right up to the foot of my back steps in the night, that I finally understood, all at once, what my grandmother's custom had truly been. It had never been foolishness. It had never been a sad old habit or a quaint superstition. It had been a contract, a price paid nightly in food and cloth set on that flat stone at the border of the woods. And in exchange for that price, the folk in the woods kept to their side, kept to the tree line, stayed out of the cleared land and away from the house, and let the people who lived there live in peace. The stone was a border. The offering was the toll that kept the border closed. My grandmother had paid that toll every dusk of her life, the way her people must have paid it before her, going back further than anyone could say. A bargain older than the farmhouse, older maybe than the family, a line drawn between the cleared land and the deep woods in nightly offerings of food and cloth. And I had erased it. I had stopped paying. I had let the stone sit empty for a week, and the folk in the woods, finding the toll unpaid, the border unkept, the contract broken, had begun to come across because There was nothing anymore to keep them on their side. And they were coming for the house, a little closer every night, to collect what was owed, or to take what was no longer being kept from them. I started the offering again that very evening. With shaking hands, at dusk, before the light was fully gone, I carried out food and a bit of cloth to the flat stone at the tree line, and I set it down the way I'd watched my grandmother do 100 times as a boy, and I said, low and awkward, not knowing the words, that I was sorry, that I hadn't understood, that the offering would not stop again. And I went back to the house and barred the door and waited. And I will tell you that I did not know, that first night, whether it would be enough, whether I had broken the bargain past mending, whether the folk in the woods, having tasted the open border, would consent to go back behind it. That first night the prints came again, close, and the padding came at the walls, and I sat up the whole night in terror that I had ruined it beyond repair. But the offering on the stone was gone in the morning, taken, and the night after that the prints did not come quite so close, and the offering again was gone. And slowly, over the following weeks, night by night, the visits drew back. The prints retreated across the garden toward the tree line. The padding on the walls grew fainter and less frequent. The watching at the windows eased. The folk in the woods drew back, a little each night, behind the stone, behind the border, as the toll was paid again and the contract was mended, until at last the cleared land was quiet again, and the prints stopped coming, and the nights were my own once more. That was years ago now, and I have never missed an offering since. Not one. In every weather, in sickness and in health, in the dead of winter and the heat of summer, I carry the offering out to that flat gray stone at the tree line every single evening at dusk, before the sun is fully down, food and a bit of cloth, set on the stone the way my grandmother said it, and I say my few low, awkward words, and I come back to the house, and I never, ever stay out past dark on the wrong side of that stone. I have never told a soul why I do it. The few people who've seen me do it think it's a sweet eccentricity, a way of honoring my grandmother's memory, and I let them think it, because there is no way to tell them the truth that doesn't sound like madness, and because some part of me fears that to speak of it too plainly might somehow weaken the bargain. I only know what I learned that one terrible week when I let the offerings lapse. I know that the stone is a border, and the offering is the toll, and the folk in the woods are real, and patient, and old, older than the farmhouse, older than my family, older, perhaps, than any of the people who have lived behind that line and kept it. And I have come to believe that some borders in those mountains are not ours, were never ours, were drawn long before we came and will hold long after we're gone, but only so long as someone on this side keeps paying the toll. So I keep it. Every dusk I keep it. Because I have learned the one thing my grandmother could never quite make me believe with words alone, which is that you keep those old borders. You keep them faithfully, and you never once let them lapse, or you learn, the hard way in the dark, why they were drawn in the first place. I got my truck stuck on an old logging road, high up on Bald Knob, just as the dark was coming down. And the long night that followed is a thing I have never told straight through to anyone, because there is no way to tell it that doesn't make people look at you a certain way. I'd been up on the mountain that afternoon, scouting for the coming hunting season, the way I'd done 100 times, taking the old logging roads that webbed those high ridges, roads that haven't been maintained in decades, grown up and washed out and barely roads at all anymore. I knew the country, or thought I did, and I'd pushed the truck further up an old grade than I should have, chasing a spot I remembered, and the light had started to go. and I'd turned around to head back down, and that's when the truck dropped into a soft rut and sank to the axle in mud and would not come out. I tried everything a man tries. I rocked it forward and back and only dug it deeper. I got out and looked, and the wheels were buried, and the light was failing fast the way it does. Up high in the late season, the cold coming down with the dark. I had no signal, of course, not up there, the phone showing nothing but a dead great bar. And I was miles from the nearest paved road, and further than that, from any house. And so I had a choice to make, and I made it the way I thought was the careful way, the survival way. I could walk down miles of rough, washed-out logging road in the full dark with a flashlight, risking a fall, a broken ankle, getting turned around in country that all looks the same at night. Or I could wait it out in the cab, warm enough with the engine to run the heater now and again, and walk out at first light when I could see and try the truck again in the morning, or hike down in daylight if I had to. I chose to stay. It seemed the sensible choice. It seemed the safe choice. I climbed back into the cab and locked the doors and settled in to wait out the night. And I had no idea, none, what I was waiting in the cab to meet. It was full dark, properly dark, the deep total black you only get that far from any light, when the first one came out of the trees. I caught it in the side mirror. I was sitting there in the dark cab, half dozing, and something made me glance at the mirror. And I saw a shape cross the road behind the truck. Just a flash of it, in the faint starlight, a thin, pale shape, low to the ground or crouched, that crossed the open road behind me, fast and quiet, and was gone into the trees on the other side. I came fully awake. I told myself it was a deer, a bear, some animal, but it hadn't moved like an animal. It had moved low and quick, and somehow wrong, and I sat up and watched the mirror, and a moment later another one crossed, then another. Thin, pale shapes, one after another, crossing the road behind my truck, fast and silent and low, coming out of the trees on one side and vanishing into the trees on the other. And then I understood, with a slow horror that started in my gut and spread out cold through all of me, that there were many of them out there in the dark, all around the truck, moving through the trees, circling, patient, curious, gathering. And then they came up to the windows. The first face appeared at the passenger window, and I will never, as long as I live, lose the sight of it. A pale face, close to the glass, peering in at me. Pale, too pale. A grayish white, and wrong. Wrong in ways I have never been able to name or describe. The proportions of it off. The eyes wrong. Something about the whole of it that my mind recoiled from. That it couldn't hold. The way you can't quite look at certain things. A pale, wrong face at my window in the dead of night, peering in at me, studying me. And then there was another at the windshield, and another at the driver's window. Faces all around the cab now, pale and silent and wrong, looking in at me where I sat frozen in the locked truck. And their hands came up. Hands flattened against the glass, pale, long-fingered hands pressing against the windows, all around the cab, testing, feeling, the palms laid flat against the glass and sliding, and I sat in the middle of it, with the keys gripped in my fist, so hard they cut into my hand. And I did not move, and I did not make a sound, and I did not breathe any louder than I had to. All night they examined me. That is the only word for what they did, all the long hours of that night, and it is the word that has haunted me ever since. They examined the truck, and they examined me inside it. The faces came and went at the windows, peering in, studying me from every angle, and the hands moved over the glass and the body of the truck, feeling it, testing it, and the shapes circled and circled in the dark around the cab, patient and unhurried and endlessly curious. But they never broke the glass. That is the thing. With all those hands pressing and testing, they never once struck the glass, never tried to smash it, never forced a door or pulled at a handle. They could have, I think. I have always thought, after, that they could have had me out of that cab anytime they chose. That the locked doors and the glass meant nothing to them. That the only reason I sat safe inside was that they did not want me out. Not yet, not that night. They only wanted to look, to study, to peer and touch and circle and examine, the way you would study a strange animal you'd found in a trap, an animal you'd never seen before, turning it this way and that, learning it, taking your time, in no hurry at all, because the thing isn't going anywhere. That is what I was to them that night. A strange creature found in a trap, something to be studied, close and patient and thorough, all the long hours of the dark. I do not know how I lived through that night, without my heart simply stopping. I sat in the middle of that cab, and I held still, and I held my silence, and I watched the pale, wrong faces come and go at the glass, and felt the hands testing the truck all around me. And I prayed harder than I have ever prayed, for the dawn. And the dawn came, finally, the way it always does, the way it has to. The sky began to gray, the faintest lightning in the east, and as the first gray light came up, they began to draw back. One by one, unhurried, in no more haste to leave than they had been to come. The pale shapes drew away from the truck and back toward the trees, the faces leaving the windows, the hands leaving the glass, the circling shapes melting back into the woods, slow and patient and deliberate, until the last of them was gone, and the road around my truck was empty and gray in the dawn light. And there was nothing to show they had ever been there at all, but the churned mud and the marks, I found later, of long bare feet in the soft ground all around the cab. And here is the thing that has sat coldest in me. All the years since, the thing I cannot reason my way past. When there was light enough to see, I started the truck and I put it in gear, and it came out of the mud on the first try. The first try. The mud that had held it fast all night, that I'd rocked and dug and fought and could not budge. Let go of the truck easy as anything the moment the light came, the wheels finding purchase, the truck pulling free, clean and simple, as though it had never truly been stuck at all. As though the mud had only ever been an excuse, as though something had only needed me held there, in that spot, on that mountain, for that one night, and once the night was over and the looking was done, the mountain simply let me go. I drove down off Bald Knob in the gray morning, shaking so hard I could barely hold the wheel, and I have never gone back up that mountain, and I have never driven a back road at dusk again, not once, in all the years since. When the light starts to go, I am off the mountain roads, and down where there are houses and lights and other people, every time, without fail. And I do not care how that looks to anyone, because I cannot lose the feeling, and it has only grown stronger with the years, that I was not trapped on that mountain by accident, that the rut and the mud were not bad luck, that something up there on Bald Knob, something pale and patient and old, wanted a long, close look at me, wanted to study me, the way you'd study a strange thing you'd never seen, and arranged to have me held there in that spot through the dark to get it. It got its look. All the long night, it got its look, and then it let me go, freed the truck, let me drive down off the mountain alive. And I have spent all the years since wondering why, wondering what it learned, looking at me through the glass all that night, wondering whether being studied that closely, that patiently, by a thing like that, is something that ever truly ends, or whether it only let me go to think about it, the way you'd release a marked animal back into the woods, knowing exactly what it is and exactly where it lives, free to take it up again whenever you choose. My father kept a second smokehouse at the far edge of our land, back where the cleared fields gave way to the deep woods that climbed up into the high country behind our farm, and he tended that smokehouse alone, and he never once let any of us near it. It stood off by itself, a small, dark, weathered building, at the very end of our property, up against the tree line, and from the time I was small, I understood without being told that it was my father's, and his alone. He went out to it every week, regular as church, carrying meat, and he went alone, and he came back alone, and he never spoke of it, and we children knew better than to ask or to follow. As a boy, I never thought it strange, or no stranger, than any of the 1,000 private ways grown men have. I believed, the way you believe simple things as a child, that the far smokehouse was just where my father cured the extra meat, the overflow, the surplus from our hogs, that there wasn't room for in the smokehouse near the house. It was such an ordinary explanation that I never questioned it, not as a boy, not as a young man, not in all the years my father lived. He went out to the far smokehouse with meat every week of his life, and I never once wondered why, and that not wondering is a thing I would give a great deal to have back. My father died when I was grown, and the farm came to me, and it fell to me to go through his things, the long, sad work of sorting out a life. And it was in that sorting that I found his journals. He'd kept them all his life, plain hard ledgers, and most of what was in them was the ordinary record of a farm, weather, and planting and stock and prices. But threaded all through them, week after week, year after year, going back as far as the journals went, was another record, a private one, and as I read it, the bottom dropped out of everything I thought I'd understood about my father, and the far smokehouse, and the land I'd grown up on. He'd been feeding them. That was the phrase he used, again and again, in his plain hand. Fed them this week. Left the usual at the far house. They were content. He'd been feeding them all his life, every week, faithfully. And as I read back through the journals, and then through his father's journals before him, which I found in the same box, I understood that it went back generations, that my grandfather had done it before my father, and his father before him, a thing handed down, father to son, all the way back to the first of our family, to farm that land. And the journals told me, slowly, in pieces, what they were. The folk in the deep woods, the thin, pale, silent people who lived back in the high country behind our land, up in the steep, forgotten country where no road went and no one farmed, who had been up there, my father wrote, longer than our family had held the land, longer than anyone could say, who were there when the first of us came to clear the fields, and who had been there ever since. They were not quite people. The journals gave me to understand, not anymore, not kin to us, something that had been up in that high country, so long it had become something else. And the arrangement, the thing handed down father to son, was this. Every week, you left meat for them at the far smokehouse, at the edge of the woods, at the border of the cleared land and the deep trees, and in exchange they kept to the high country. They stayed back. They left the farm and the family in peace. The meat at the far smokehouse was a price paid, a tribute, a peace kept, week after week, generation after generation, my father and his father before him quietly, feeding the pale folk of the high woods to keep them content and keep them back, and never once speaking of it to anyone, because that was part of it too, the silence, the not speaking, the carrying of it alone. The last entry in my father's last journal was different from all the others. It was written in a shakier hand, when he was already sick, already failing, near the end. And it was not a record. It was a plea. He wrote it, I understood, to whoever would find it after he was gone, to me, though he could not bring himself to say it to my face while he lived. He begged whoever read it to keep it up, to keep feeding them, to never, ever let the arrangement lapse, not for a week, not once. And he wrote, in that shaking hand, the reason, the thing he had never told me, that he had seen when he was a boy, what happened to a neighboring family that had stopped. A family on the next farm over, he wrote, that had let the feeding lapse, that had decided, the way I would later decide, that it was foolishness, an old superstition, a thing the modern world had outgrown. He did not write what became of them. He only wrote that he had seen it, as a boy, and that he had fed the folk in the woods faithfully every week of his life since, and would feed them till he died, and that I must do the same, and never stop, and never speak of it, and never let it lapse. Keep it up, the last line read in his failing hand. For all our sakes, keep it up. I am sorry to leave it to you. I did not believe it. I will be honest about that, because it is the heart of what I have to confess, and because my disbelief is the thing I have paid for, and am paying for still. I read my father's journals, and I read his dying plea, and I felt grief and unease, and a strange cold I couldn't name, but I did not believe. I was a modern man. I did not believe that thin, pale folk lived in the high country behind our farm, or that my family had been feeding them for generations, or that meat left at a smokehouse kept anything at bay. I decided it was the long private madness of a lonely line of farmers, a superstition passed down and elaborated. My father's mind perhaps softened at the end by his illness. I grieved my father, and I honored him in the ordinary ways, and I let the far smokehouse stand empty. I did not leave the meat. For a whole season, through that first springs, and into the summer, the far smokehouse stood empty and dark at the edge of the woods, and I left nothing in it. And I told myself I had put away a foolish old custom, and for a while nothing happened, and I thought I'd been proven right. I was not proven right. They came down out of the high country to find out why the food had stopped. It began the way these things always seem to begin in that country, small, at the edges, easy to dismiss. The feeling of being watched from the tree line at dusk. Then shapes there, thin and pale at the edge of the woods where the far smokehouse stood, glimpsed and gone. Then prints in the soft ground near the smokehouse, long and narrow and barefoot, and then closer, across the back field, and then closers still. They came down out of their high country, the folk my family had fed and kept back for generations, and they came looking, patient and silent and curious, to find out why the meat had stopped, why the old arrangement had been broken, why the tribute that had been paid them faithfully for longer than anyone could remember had suddenly ceased. And night by night, they came closer to the house, the same slow patient, narrowing in, the prints in the field a little nearer each morning, the watching at the tree line a little bolder each dusk, the pale shapes drawing in toward the lit windows of the house where I lay awake until I understood, far too late, lying there in the dark, listening to something move around my house, that every word my father had written had been true, and that I had broken a peace my family had kept for 100 years and more, and that the folk in the woods had noticed, and were coming to collect. I started the meat again, that very week, with shaking hands. The way I imagined my father once did, I carried meat out to the far smokehouse at the edge of the woods, and left it there. Far more than my father's journals ever recorded, leaving as much as I could spare, and more, a desperate overpayment, an apology written in meat. And I left it, and I came back to the house, and I waited to see if it would be enough. And slowly, over weeks, over a whole season of leaving, far more than my father ever had, the visits began to draw back. The prince retreated across the field toward the tree line. The watching at the dusk eased. The pale folk drew back, a little each week, toward their high country. As the meat appeared again at the far smokehouse, as the broken arrangement was, I prayed, slowly mended, but it has never gone all the way back to how it was. That is the thing. My father fed them once a week, a steady, modest tribute, and it kept them content and kept them back at the tree line of the high country, far up, out of sight, a peace so quiet I grew up never knowing it was kept. I feed them far more, twice and 3 times what he did. And still, they do not draw back all the way. Still I feel them closer than the journals say they ever were in my father's day. Still the prints come further down the field than his ever recorded. Still the watching at the dusk is nearer than it should be. And so I do not know, anymore, what it is I am doing out at the far smokehouse every week, with my arms full of meat. I do not know whether I am keeping an old piece, the way my father and his father and all of them kept it, or whether I am only paying down a debt, because I broke the arrangement. I let it lapse, one season, out of disbelief, and they came down out of the high country, and they learned the way down, learned the path from their woods to my house, learned that the tribute could stop, and that when it stopped, they could come closer. And I am afraid, deeply and constantly afraid, that you cannot simply restart a thing like that. That the peace my family kept for 100 years was a fragile thing that depended on never once being broken, and that my one season of modern foolishness broke it past full mending, that I let them taste the open border, and they will never again be as content to stay all the way back as they were, before they knew it could be crossed. I feed them more and more, far more than I can really spare, and still they come a little closer than they should. And I have started to understand that I may be feeding a debt that only grows, that my one season of disbelief made larger than I will ever live to repay. I will feed them every week till I die, the way my father asked. I have no choice now, but I have no son to leave it to, no one to hand the silence and the meat and the far smokehouse too. And on the nights when the prints come close, and the pale shapes watch from the tree line, I lie awake, and I wonder what happens when I am gone, and there is no one left who knows to keep the peace. And I think about that neighboring family my father saw as a boy, the ones who stopped, and the thing he saw and would not write down, and I am afraid that I already know how it ends.